And he's sitting there going, my life has been nothing but suffering, and I'm not looking to justify my life or appreciate life by changing that suffering. I'm looking at my life and trying to appreciate in tandem with the suffering.
There is something wrong with me right now. There is something wrong with, existence in general, with my life. And the thing that is wrong with it is that I haven't found the right person yet. And as soon as I find the right person, everything will be fine. We'll be in love and it'll just go on forever. But of course, real love is hard work. It's not something easy. Imagine if a demon sort of comes to you in the middle of the night in your loneliest of lonelies, and he tells you that your life as you have lived it, you have already lived it infinite times in the past, and you will live it infinite times in the future in exactly the same way, and there's nothing else but your life forever.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Athan Yanos Show. I'm here today with a very special guest, William Hamilton, who you probably know from past episodes. But as opposed to last time, William Hamilton is now a master's philosophy student at KU Leuven, and he will be presenting his paper very soon entitled Affirming the Now, Nietzsche, Zen, and the Critique of Salvation. So, William, thank you so much for being here once again. It's been a while, but it's great to have you back.
Yeah, it's great to be on. It has been a while, and it's good to see the channel is still thriving since when I last left it. Congratulations on that, and to all the viewers, I'm, you know, glad to be back.
Yeah, well, we were kind of uh, going off of the steam you left, and now we need to reboot. We need more fuel,
I'm
so
sure.
that's
I'm
why you're back.
sure.
Listen, I I know your paper is on Nietzsche and Buddhism, but I know from you personally that Nietzsche is someone that you are super passionate about. You're obsessed with. You've been obsessed with for a decent amount of time. Um, and before we get into like the specifics of his ideas, one of the things that I think is really important to do uh, in all subject matters, but particularly philosophy and one that becomes very complex, is how do you explain it to somebody that hasn't read a lot of the things that you've read, hasn't studied it for the length that you know, isn't familiar with the same terms that those of us who have gone through a philosophy degree are. Um, so to make this episode more accessible to the everyday person, and that's not a derogatory term, that's just somebody who hasn't studied philosophy. Can you explain to me in the most broad terms possible who Nietzsche was, what was his main ideas, and why the hell are you so damn obsessed with him?
So Nietzsche's a very interesting character. I mean, also for the impact he's left. I mean, the way he's treated now, he's an incredibly famous philosopher, probably one of the most famous ones, besides the ancient Greeks and a few other names. And well, it's also interesting because although he's very famous, both I think academically and outside, in academia he's always very frequently referenced. But in both cases, I think there's very few people who actually go in depth in Nietzsche ideas. He's always brought up in the conversation, and he's always sort of acknowledged as an important person, but rarely is he ever the central focus. So I think it's important to dig in deep. And I mean, the main thing he's known for is for being very radical. He represents a break from the dominant Western tradition in lots of ways. In the 18th century, obviously, the main thing is, I think, the Enlightenment. Right? There's a general post-Kantian, with the Enlightenment, a focus on reason, and what Nietzsche calls the death of God, which is probably his most famous saying. What he's referring to there is the loss in belief in God in society, which he sort of saw a lot sooner than a lot of other people. And the main thing that preoccupied him was how are we going to replace this loss of God? And the Enlightenment project generally sees reason as filling in the role that God used to play. Reason can ground morality, sort of as long as we continue in focusing on reason and empirical evidence, sort of we will figure out the best way to live. And this was what religion previously did. Nietzsche pushes back against this very heavily. And he sees reason as just being incapable of fulfilling that role in principle. And that's a big that's a very big statement, especially for a philosophy student like I was. um, I mean, the reason one gets into philosophy a lot is based on this kind of idea, maybe subconsciously, that if we think hard enough and just do philosophy and study, eventually we'll be able to figure out what to do with our lives, the true nature of reality, and align ourselves with this. That's generally the trend in most of Western philosophy, the project you'd say that most of philosophers are trying to do. And yeah, for me, reading Nietzsche was a sort of very big personal shock of like, wow. It sort of exposes, first of all, what I didn't even know that I thought of things in that way, and it gave me a whole new perspective on how one might approach philosophy.
So I want to come back to this idea in a little bit, but I just want to first summarize briefly what you said, and you can tell me if this is correct or not. The idea is that God is dead, and so people need some way to orient their lives or justify their actions without God. And he thinks that, contrary to most of the Enlightenment tradition, reason is incapable of doing that.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, we have a idea in philosophy at the time that we're unbiased thinkers. That in doing philosophy, we're sort of setting our own personal biases aside and getting closer to the objective truth. And morality is included in that. Obviously, the ethics, this whole study of ethics, is supposed to be that. Um, but Nietzsche pushes heavily against this. For him, probably one of his biggest insights, and I think one of the ones that personally, I guess, hit me the most, is that all of the philosophy you do, no matter how it might seem like you're a sort of a clean surgeon who has cleaned his hands and is carefully dissecting uh, the body, your hands are always going to be dirty. Whatever philosophy you have, and this is especially true in the domain of ethics, but Nietzsche extends this to any metaphysics and all of philosophy. It's ultimately a reflection of your own character. Nietzsche calls it a personal confession. Every philosophy hitherto has been a personal confession to one's own psychological state. And yeah, so Nietzsche's goal when he sort of analyzes other philosophers, which is really interesting, is he doesn't actually look at the philosophy. He looks at the philosophy behind the philosophy. So he says, there's always a philosophy underwriting the philosophy you put out. And Nietzsche is very influential in this point because it's sort of a precursor to psychoanalysis, basically, that your verbal reports, what you say you believe in, what you say you want, aren't really, truly what you actually want. There are the hidden desires that are always under work, hidden drives in Nietzsche's terminology. And that for
So,
me was a very personal sort of revelation. It sort of actually had to make me stop and think, like, why is it that I philosophize? What do I want from philosophy? What is the things that are being expressed by the philosophical views that I have?
so one of the things I think that can be helpful to do, and I think really fits with this theme, is putting a character to the ideas. So, could you just talk about like Nietzsche's life, like literally his life, the things that he went through, and how that shaped this idea that you're talking about now?
So I'd say the main thing that characterizes Nietzsche in his life is he had a life of extreme suffering. It's almost impossible to separate his life from this, for his philosophy from this, in fact. And he doesn't try to, unlike the way he criticizes other thinkers who is, they try to abstract their philosophy from themselves to reach an objective truth. Nietzsche wholeheartedly accepts that, no, my philosophy is a reflection of who I am. And it's almost a source of pride for this. And so, yeah, Nietzsche's was born in a religious family but lost his faith after a while. His father, who was a pastor, died at a very young age, and throughout his whole life, he was sick, very sick. He had bouts of migraines which would last like weeks on end, with temporary blindness and vomiting all the time. He was incapable of doing anything, and sort of, I think the loss of faith definitely impacted him a lot because obviously there was no meaning to all this suffering. He's struggling to find any meaning in this, and sort of the secular moralities that took the place of Christianity, for instance, like utilitarianism under a strict utilitarian calculus, we would judge that Nietzsche's life was terrible because it had far more suffering than it did pleasure. But Nietzsche wants to reject that. Obviously, he sees like, who are you to tell me that my life isn't worth living? His philosophical project is essentially finding a reason to affirm life in and of itself. He wants to make all the suffering worth it, in a sense, and that's why Nietzsche is. You connect to his philosophy on a much more personal level. I think it's Badiou who said this when he was asked about Nietzsche. He said that even though you may disagree with Nietzsche, you can't really see Nietzsche as sort of a philosopher like you do in most other thinkers. Nietzsche is more of like a friend, almost, he says. When you're reading Nietzsche's work, I always feel you feel a personal connection to him, because the project that he's embarking on is one that's deeply personal and relatable, and I think it's worth reading his books with always that in mind.
So it's something like Nietzsche had a life of immense suffering, immense pain, and he's looking at all these other philosophers who are saying, well, there's something better outside of that pain, outside of that suffering that can justify your life. And he's sitting there going, my life has been nothing but suffering, and I'm not looking to justify my life or appreciate life by changing that suffering. I'm looking at my life and trying to appreciate in tandem with the suffering.
Yes, yes,
Is
yes.
that
The suffering in of itself, like life in of itself. I mean, his main criticism of Christianity, which is part of what my paper gets to, is the whole notion of salvation. He thinks it puts up, that we need to be saved from our current lives. That our current lives, Christianity implicitly gives a negative value judgment to life because it says that life is only worth something insofar as it leads to the kingdom of God. And Nietzsche wants to push back against this a lot. You see this as a nihilistic point of view, which is strange considering obviously nihilism is usually seen as the opposite of Christianity. But Nietzsche calls Christianity itself nihilistic because of its devaluation of life. And so, Nietzsche's project is to be able to value life in and of itself intrinsically.
well? I do have some qualms with the critique of Christianity from a Kierkegaardian perspective, but maybe we'll come to that later.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
but how is it then that Nietzsche says that we are supposed to appreciate life in and of itself, even if we are enduring immense pain, immense suffering, etc.? Walk me through that.
Well, there isn't a strict sort of path in order to do this, right? And this is one of Nietzsche's key points as well, because anytime you sort of set out a path for someone, you are rejecting their inherent particularity, their subjectivity. Everyone's path to sort of, I guess, spiritual actualization, if you want to use these terms, because that is what Nietzsche is essentially interested in. He's a post-religious thinker, people have called him. Although a lot of people read him as a sort of materialist atheist who's, rejects anything spiritual. That's not really true, and that's not really true when you look at his inclinations as well. Him being born in a religious family and all this. One of his criticisms of Christianity, to quote him, is that it is spiritually limited as a religion. It closes out like possibilities for your life. So Nietzsche is certainly a spiritual thinker, and his goal is to basically make a new spirituality in the death of God. And affirming life is this his kind of spirituality, how he sees spirituality to be. So got a bit distracted. What was your question?
Well, I mean, this idea of affirming life. How do we practice that on a tangible everyday basis? What is his mechanism
Right.
that he says that the diagnosis or prognosis for how we should affirm life, even if like we're suffering from syphilis, I'm just throwing shit out there like syphilis, back pain, health concerns, tragedies, etc.
Yeah. Well, as I was saying, yes, there's there's no straight path, and this is one of the difficulties and maybe frustrations in reading Nietzsche, because we want sort of someone to tell us what to do when we see this, when we see sort of the state that Nietzsche, the way things Nietzsche lays out, the way Nietzsche lays out things, where our immediate concern is to go like, well, how is this possible? How is this possible? And the answer is that there's no there's no way you can come to this just by reading an outside source. It always has to come from within. As he says, sort of the philosophy you adopt is always going to be a reflection of your character. So thinking about it isn't going to solve this. I'd say obviously there are some tangible sort of things that he does, but these are more sort of broad guidelines. I think one of the main ones is the valuation of reason, right? Because of the Enlightenment, reason has always held the primary role, the primacy of reason. But this actually goes far back, way before the Enlightenment. I mean, Nietzsche reads all of Western philosophy as a history of constantly trying to fight away the fear of uncertainty, because this is what he sees as the ground of philosophizing, of wanting to find the truth. It's a fear of uncertainty, essentially. A fear of uncertainty and a need to have control, basically. So you feel like your life is in order and everything is fine, in a sense. And this goes back to Socrates, the founder of Western philosophy, the entire Western canon. In the Phaedo, when he's dying, he is remarkably chill with the fact that he's about to die. And one of his interlocutors asks him why this is so, and he always says because he believes he figured out that nous or mind was sort of the primary thing through a discussion with I don't remember who, but nous is sort of the ground of existence, and nous will survive death. So that's all fine. And nous is translated as mind usually, but nous actually refers to sort of goal-oriented, sort of mind in the ancient Greek. The word is sort of mind in an analytic, problem-solving sense in order to get to some certain place. So the whole history of Western philosophy is founded on this idea of the primacy of goal-seeking behavior, right? And the goal-seeking behavior in this case is to find the truth and to rid oneself of the fear of uncertainty. Um, but for Nietzsche, this is an unsustainable approach because, again, there are some things reason can't do, and reason turns on itself, turns on yourself, or your instincts, rather. The primacy of reason above instincts is um, unsustainable in a sense because reason, the valuing of reason to such a high point comes from an instinct itself. It can't itself be justified by reason.
Explain that one more time in layman terms, because that was kind of hard for me to understand.
Yeah, of course. So, um, in the Socratic tradition, there is always a um, primacy of reason. What Nietzsche calls like the tyranny of reason over all else, and the primacy of reason causes you to doubt your own instincts, right? Because your instincts aren't rationally justifiable; they're just things that pre-exist you. And the reason why this is a bit unsustainable is because the drive to place reason as the highest, the most important factor in your life, sort of to give it all this normative value, is based on an instinct. It's based on this instinct to avoid uncertainty and try to grasp this ultimate truth that you think will ground yourself and make you feel more secure, right? Um, so when reason is sort of employed as a weapon against the instincts, it is attacking itself in a sense, right? And this is what causes the death of God for Nietzsche ultimately, actually. Because Christianity is what he calls an extension of Platonism, right? It's following from the Socratic tradition. It's Platonism for the masses, he says. And he's not the only one who says this, in fact. I mean, I think Augustine, when he found Plato's books, was remarking that it's like insane how similar Plato is to how neatly Plato fits into the Christian framework, right? He even wondered if Plato was had perhaps encountered like the Israelites back in the day and had some knowledge of Judaism. But regardless, what we're saying, yes. So the instinct for truth, to reach the ultimate truth, which in Platonism is the forms, in Christianity it's God, heaven. It turns on itself because the need for truth sort of like turns on the own instinct for truth and reveals that to be empty itself. And so you're left with the situation we are in now, where sort of everything is devalued. Um, so Nietzsche essentially, to get to the point of how to practically sort of, one practical thing you can put on is to trust your instincts again, basically, to understand that there's no sense in doubting instincts beyond a certain point. We're used to this extreme rationalism by which the only time that you can value something is when it is rationally justified to value so. But for Nietzsche, there isn't any more. The source of normative value is itself your instincts. We have this notion of wanting to abstract ourselves from our own instincts, our own desires, our own inclinations, and view them from a third person perspective. But that
I
perspective doesn't exist.
Can I just put this into very like basic terms and tell me if there's something wrong in this characterization based on what you said? So the project of rationality or reason is to avoid uncertainty, and in doing that, we replace our instincts with reason
Yeah, well, you value reason over the instincts, and you doubt your
over the
instincts
instincts.
because they're not rationally justified. Yes.
And he's saying reason is insufficient to entirely replace like these it's insufficient to get rid of uncertainties, and it using thinking that it is prohibits us from uh, acting based off of our instincts in times when we should.
Yes, yes. Well, I guess it's sort of like the value of the primacy of reason. The whole idea of reason is the most important thing that I need to use in all my situations to figure out how I should act. The valuing of reason there is still based on another instinct, right? So it's sort of like, I guess it's almost like you're acting on a false assumption when you try treat reason as fundamental, because a lot of people do this even in modern philosophy. I think there's this assumption that sort of the the drive for truth is sort of a fundamental, categorical norm. As a brief digression, I could point to like error theory for anyone who's familiar with that. Error theory about morality is sort of saying that moral judgments are, not false because they have to be categorical if they exist, and nothing else is categorical. And categorical is like without conditions, independent of desires. And one of the common arguments against that from defenders of morality is that truth functions in the same way. So morality is not alone. Truth is also independent of desires. But I've always found that to be one of the worst arguments, because if you're already rejecting morality, why would you not also reject the truth, the value of morality? You would also reject the value of truth. There's no real sense. You would be very inconsistent to reject one and not the other. So yeah, it's sort of like the primacy of reason is used by some as an argument against um, the an argument, like it's almost as if it's self-justifying. It doesn't need any more justifying. Like, of course, truth is sort of primary.
Hmm. I love examples. I'm a big example person. So can you give me some examples that besides Nietzsche himself that he thinks abides by this principle or holds up this principle, if he mentions any, or just give me some hypothetical scenarios where this is actualized, because it's very theoretical right now, and I want to put it into the practical world.
Okay, as in thinking about practical ways in which reason has its limitations. I mean,
Yes.
this is a very common practice in most like sort of therapeutic situations. A lot of anxiety is caused by this very false notion that I must like think of a way to get out of this problem. I feel sort of like uncertainty, and I don't know what to choose, and I just like keep on thinking, and I can't stop thinking. I think this fundamentally is based on a mistrust of instincts. The instinctual person doesn't need to think so much, because he sort of has an intuition about it. He intuitively knows what what sort of situation reacts well with the kind of person he is and whatnot.
The idea is something like there's this problem, and there's this way that I'm feeling. I must just be able to solve it by reasoning my way to the solution. And in most cases, I think people would understand that that's not the case. There's a lot of situations where you're in where you can't reason. Reason doesn't get you to the the resolution.
Yeah. I think it's important here to know that a lot of people, as soon as they hear these things from Nietzsche, they immediately think that he's like anti-reason. I've heard this. It's the same sort of critique you get for the postmodernist types, and Nietzsche is actually a pre-postmodernist. You know, a lot of people give him sort of credit for his influence on existentialism, which is true. He's one of the first existentialists, you might say, but he's also one of the first postmodernists. Because of his rejection of truth and his perspectivism and these kinds of things. But again, none of these people are against reason. You know, acknowledging the limitations of reason is not being against reason. You know, it's setting its right place. Otherwise, even like Kant, for instance, would be against reason, which is kind of ridiculous.
I mean, this idea of uh, realizing or embracing that reason isn't sufficient or doesn't go far enough to account for most instances. Do you think in society right now that we've embraced this idea? I mean, I know it's not a specific to Nietzsche idea, but it's one that's heavily associated with him. Are we practicing that now in society, or do you think we still have much more to go?
Yeah, no, I don't think we're very close to what Nietzsche would envision, at least, or what would be a healthy amount. There's still, I think, a lot of, you know, um, mistrust of the instincts and placing reason on top of everything else. I mean, despite a lot of sort of philosophical and academic work, you know, as I mentioned, postmodernism, for instance, and a lot of insights in psychology, I think, which acknowledge the limitations of reason. I think as a society, we're still like quite far from embracing it. I think the biggest change now would probably be in terms of science, because I mean that was obviously a big factor for the Enlightenment as well. But that drive has only hypertrophied in time now. So we look to science for the answer to a lot of questions which science can't really give. You know, science is very good at what it does, but what it does is make predictions for the future and use that to build technology and you know, help our lives. And it's very good at doing that. But I think there is still an idea that science is somehow going to give us values, tell us how we should live our lives, and that is something that's simply out of the domain of science, and which is what science can't do. And I also think, given the death of God, science has obviously tried to fill in this void, right, as the giver of normativity, the thing that tells us what we should be doing with our lives. And I think technology and AI as sort of a culmination, sort of the highest point of this technology, is an even more strong instinct in this direction. You know, I think there is a sort of idea in what we're doing with AI and technology broadly that we can outsource our search for how we should live our lives. Um, Once technology and AI become more advanced enough, we can sort of just like give these questions to the AI, and the AI will solve it for us. Um, but obviously that isn't going to work, because again, morality, how you should live your life, is a inherently inescapably personal sort of question, and no external factor can really tell you how you should live your life.
There's so many things I want to say, and I want to keep it on Nietzsche, but I there's a lot of uh, questions that I have for you. Um, in terms of, I do want to touch on this AI question, because I do think that is one thing that a lot of people are feeling is like we're getting to the point where we're essentially saying we don't need humans because AI and these high techs can do reason better than humans can. And you're saying that Nietzsche's response to that would be yes, AI can do certain things and reason well, much better than humans can, but we can't eliminate the human element to it because there is limitations to these to what reason can get us to, and that's one of the main reasons why, like you said, high tech AI, all of these high powered machines are never going to be able to uh, replace like human tasks, human things. And I guess if you do think that AI can replace most of human tasks and most of human experience, then you probably are thinking that to reach the highest truths, or to kind of that the highest amount of reason or the highest order of reason is sufficient to to accomplish or to fulfill life.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's related again to what my paper is about, which is like salvation and soteriology, the same as the doctrine of salvation, which is the target of Nietzsche's criticism in Christianity. But I think with the death of God, sort of there are a lot of secular versions of this salvation. The sort of the drive for salvation hasn't been abolished. A lot of atheists would like to think they have. As soon as they stop believing in God, they think they're rid of sort of the religious impulse and um, the any kind of religious connotations, but of course they're not, and they just move this drive to be saved away from God and into something else. And I think AI is certainly one of those sort of like it's less of a personal one, I'd say, because I don't think you'll get many people who will say consciously, first of all, that they think AI will um, you know usher in a utopia, but even on a personal level, I don't think they're banking a lot on AI doing this. I think the personal sort of like means of salvation following the loss of the death of God would be more something like, I don't know, romantic love, I'd say, or fame. I think is a big one in nowadays society, and money, I suppose. Um, but AI would be more of, I think, a collective project, collective salvation project, and hope that we've put ourselves into.
Now that's a really fascinating idea, and I think one that's starting to get talked about more, but still definitely not enough, is this idea that salvation outside of a religious connotation, that there can be that we're at the point now where maybe people are going away from the religious salvation, but there's a different kind of salvation that people are embracing, and whether
Yeah,
that's and can you just talk a little bit about that, if that's something that you're able to speak on?
yeah, absolutely. As I said, the um, even though we've sort of decided as a society that we don't value sort of religion as such, um, we still have the impulses within us, the desire for salvation, which devalues our current life and makes us want to be saved from something else. To bring it back to Nietzsche quite briefly, I'll say the point of my paper in comparing it with Zen as well, especially, is that sort of Nietzsche's solution to this is to get rid of that impulse in the first place, right? To get rid of the impulse for salvation. That is sort of, you could see as his project, and he thinks that's the only way, I think, that you can properly deal with the death of God is by sort of taking a step back to pre-Christian, pre-Socratic times as well. I mean, a step back in a sense that's misleading. Um, I'd say there are things he would like to emulate from the pre-Socratics, but not necessarily be like them. But anyway, yes. I was just saying the way that sort of individually and societally we now view salvation. Yeah, well, as I was saying, those three ones are probably, I think, the most prominent individual responses: love, fame, and money. There's an obsession with all three of them, which goes far beyond the point of just like wanting it for our own personal pleasure. Um, I think you know love is maybe the most striking one. That I think we get this myth that there is something wrong with me right now. There is something wrong with existence in general, with my life. And the thing that is wrong with it is that I haven't found the right person yet. And as soon as I find the right person, everything will be fine. We'll be in love, and it'll just go on forever. But of course, real love is hard work. It's not something easy, and it won't alleviate that sense of something being wrong with you. I mean, as a society, are obsessed with romantic love. We see this in all, like, movies and culture and the way we speak about this and everything. But it wasn't always the case. Certainly, actually, in Greek times, Plutarch has a passage where he talks about all the various forms of love, and romantic love is brought up, eros, and an obsession with eros, sort of like devoting yourself to your romantic partner, wholeheartedly, to the point where you would sacrifice your life for them. That was sort of seen as weird, right? He mentioned it's kind of a weird thing. They sort of acknowledge that, yeah, it happens sometimes, and when you see these kinds of people, you sort of look at them with a bit of pity. Maybe they've been afflicted by some kind of like strange disease. And this is not to say they don't value romantic love at all. Of course, it's important. They just don't have this obsession with it, where you sort of devote your entire life to this.
So, as I take it just from what you said, Nietzsche's critique is not so much, is not limited to this kind of religious salvation. It's the thinking that there is this type of, there is a higher world that can save you. It is thinking in terms of there's something out there that can save me.
Yes.
That's the critique, and not necessarily like religious salvation is included in that critique, but it's far broader than that because it's about thinking that you can be saved. That there's a higher thing that can save you from your problems and your suffering.
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So, the Hinterwelt is Nietzsche's term for the behind world. That's what it literally means. It's German for behind world, and Nietzsche has a great chapter in Twilight of the Idols, my favorite book, where he details the history of Western philosophy according to the idea of this Hinterwelt, this behind world. So since Plato, he thinks philosophy has been an attempt to sort of reach this behind world, to escape from this current world and find meaning and fulfillment in the behind world. And the first example of this is obviously with Plato, with Plato's forms. And for Plato, the forms are reachable, in the famous allegory of the cave. If you become a philosopher and act morally, you can reach the good and sort of partake in the true reality. The true reality is available to the sage and the wise man. Then in Christianity, the true world is not accepted. Not You can't reach it right now, but it's promised to you later. To the sage, again, to the sinner who repents. Then you sort of get the Enlightenment, and you get the Kantian behind world, which is the noumena. Famously Kant divides between the appearance and reality, the way things appear, and the thing in itself that we have no knowledge or access to. And the thing in itself is the Hinterwelt this time. But the thing about the thing in itself is now that it's you can't access it, you can't know anything about it. It's just there, and you just know it's there, and it's supposed to still give you moral duty and obligations, but it can't do that. What he's tracing in this chapter is sort of the way that the Hinterworld has been slipping from our hands. Philosophy has been less and less able to sort of justify, to come up with a world, behind world, that justifies this current world. And so, sort of the Enlightenment project is basically to say, let's just get rid of this world. We don't need this world. But the problem is that the values we use now are still based on the idea that this behind world, this hinterworld, still exists, right? And in doing so, we place a negative value judgment on this world because it gets redeemed when the other world grounds it. So when we get rid of the other world, we're just left with the negative value judgment on this world, and that's it, and that's the nihilism that Nietzsche is so worried about.
Explain to me how one more time how we get from abandoning the other world to nihilism.
So the point
Oh
of the
wait,
other
wait.
world.
So it's that if there is no goal to reach that higher world, then and you're left with just this current world that you interpret as being worse or not worth anything, then nothing matters because none of your actions are going toward reaching this higher world, this better world. So nothing matters then.
Yes, yes, yes. According to sort of the culture and the tradition we've borne up with, right? Our current world is only valuable insofar as it leads to the real world, that we're partaking in by doing philosophy or by being religious or whatever else it may be. When we get rid of the real world, um, we basically the world becomes valueless. Like there is no value in the world. The important to note, and this is where sort of Nietzsche will interject and say that nihilism isn't a necessary um, result from the fact that there is no other world. It's the fact that there is no other world plus the fact that we believe that the other world is the only thing that can redeem this current world. Sort of the fact that we still hold on to this goal oriented behavior, the nous, as I was saying from Socrates before, um, because we have this teleological, goal oriented mindset in always trying to find value in sort of like a future that we're never reaching, something that we can't, that isn't in the here and the now, right? All these philosophical systems and all these hinterworlds are never the here and the now. They're always something that's hidden and that we've got to, it's our task to realize, right? Um, yeah, so it's sort of a combination of those two. And Nietzsche will interject here, as I was saying, by instead of trying to to come up with a new goal, right? Which is, I think, a lot of what is being done in most in a lot of movements right now. I think the existentialist movement, which while is always inspired by Nietzsche, is profoundly anti-Nietzschean in the sense that that is what they do. When they say sort of God can't give us the purpose, so it's sort of like our it's up to us to create a purpose. I think from a Nietzschean perspective, they're still operating under the teleological assumptions of sort of the hinterworld, and so it'd be mostly insufficient. The goal of Nietzsche's work is to get rid of this teleology, get rid of a desire for another world, get rid of the desire to be saved. It's an anti-soteriology, right? And this is where the parallels with Zen come in.
So I do want to get to the Zen Buddhism. We were talking about how in modern day though that we have a lot of people have abandoned this idea of religious salvation, this the soteriology in the form of religious, although it's not gone, but it's certainly much less than it was in the past. But that's kind of being replaced with like earthly or ideal, like it's like the idea of Plato's forms. They're not grounded in something divine, but they they exist very much in the form of like an ideal form of love,
Yes,
an
yes, yes,
ideal
yes.
form of success, something like that, and we can see that, and please tell me if you disagree with me, but we can see that in the way that we have dating apps now, or we have like these different systems that are supposed to try to get us to create the perfect form of something. Even with food, right? We have all these genetic modifications of this food to make it look, and when you see it in the grocery store, you don't see the way fruit looks just naturally. It's like they try to do things to food to make the apple more red, to make the banana more yellow, because it's like we're trying to create the ideal apple, the ideal banana, the ideal form of love, the ideal career, or like even in with all this and this might be a controversial point, but with all of this like meditation and self-help and therapy and all these things, like I'm trying to create the ideal, like there's almost an obsession with people in our generation of like I'm trying to create the perfect experience in my life where I don't feel pain, I don't suffer, I don't care what other people think, I don't I'm free to do whatever I want. There's no consequences. I fully accept who I am. Like, and I'm just kind of in this flow state.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I 100% agree with everything you said. It's very striking, I think. And from a Nietzschean point of view, we would say that this instinct to create the ideal is always born in a profound hatred of the actual. Right? You just think that existence right now, the way things are, is unacceptable. You have a sort of instinctive fear and hatred of it, and so the only way you can cope with this is by projecting how you want existence to be in some sort of ideal which you strive towards. And I mean, yeah, a lot of the problems I think are caused by this. Again, the fact that teleology, the news, goal oriented behavior is baked into sort of like everything, the way we do things. And the problem with doing this is that it divides things into good and bad, right? Either you are acting according to um, the the telos, the goal, which is the goal of all of existence, right? If we look at it from a more religious sense as well, if you come up with sort of all of existence being directed towards some other thing like the hinterworld, like heaven, then everything is either in accordance with this, is more real, or it is not, and anything that is not in accordance with the purpose of the universe is bad, is to be destroyed. It's something that you want to excise from yourself. And the problem is that a lot of the instincts we have are things that we would judge to be not in accordance with this telos. So we come to sort of hate ourselves. This is Nietzsche's point of resentment. Um, yeah.
But we should be, according to Nietzsche, we should be embracing all of those things and seeing them as good in and of itself. Not we shouldn't be striving to change those things, but we should be striving to see those things and embrace those things as something that is both necessary and positive.
Yes, yes. Well, the main attitude Nietzsche calls us to embrace is an attitude of amor fati, right? Which is something he takes from the Stoics and literally means love of one's fate. It's the idea of just being completely content with the here and now and wanting absolutely nothing to be different, all in the past and forever in the future. And yeah, he's also stresses sort of unity of opposites. His book Beyond Good and Evil, the really famous one, it's obviously arguing against the binary of good and evil, but it's also arguing against binaries in general. And this is because for Nietzsche, all sort of these phenomena are interlinked. Good and evil and right and wrong and all these things are only make sense in opposition to each other. So you can't really remove sort of this one part that you don't like and sort of only focus on the good part. Um, you know, I think the best point you can see this is with like joy and suffering. I mean, Nietzsche himself talks about this. This is his own life is a testament to this in some sense, because even though he suffered like heavily, he would have moments of incredible joy as soon as he was healthy. He was completely sick and didn't, was vomiting, couldn't see, had intense migraines for weeks on end. And then as soon as he came out of his sort of period of illness, he would go on these insane, like 8-hour hikes and, write entire books in multiple days, in just a few days. And the way he describes it, at least in particular his autobiography Ecce Homo, if that's where you want to see most of that books, is it's very interesting to see the least. And I think Nietzsche himself embodies this sort of attitude that he's advocating for, this unity of opposites, this paradox of sort of health and sickness and truth and falsity and good and
Beyond,
bad and joy and
be,
suffering.
beyond the good and evil.
Yeah, indeed.
So you I want to transition because you talk about in your paper that I mentioned at the top of the show, this idea of eternal recurrence, and how that very much plays a role in I believe how that plays a role in Nietzsche's idea of how we should avoid or turn away from the soteriological perspective. But before we talk about that, the critique of this from the Buddhist perspective, Zen Buddhist perspective, Can you just tell me a little bit about, like, explain what that concept is and how it relates into what we're just talking about Nietzsche's philosophy?
Yeah, so the eternal recurrence is a very important part of his philosophy. I mean, he says himself that it's sort of the crown of his own philosophy. But considering that it's very vague and unclear when he does bring it up, it's only brought up maybe in like 3 times in his entirety of his texts, and so there's a lot of different interpretations as to what exactly he's trying to say when he's doing that and when he's saying this. But in my view, it's supposed to be the ultimate affirmation of life, of the attitude of amor fati, sort of in practice. So the eternal recurrence is like a thought experiment, which he posits in The Gay Science, where he says, imagine if a demon sort of comes to you in the middle of the night, in your loneliest of lonelies, and he tells you that your life as you have lived it, you have already lived it infinite times in the past, and you will live it infinite times in the future in exactly the same way. And there's nothing else but your life forever. You know, every single sigh and every single bit of suffering and dissatisfaction will be repeated forever. And the point of the eternal recurrence is to tease out what your attitude towards life is. You know, Nietzsche reckons that most people, when faced with this demon, would not be happy at this result. They would sort of think, "Oh no, my life is meaningless because that's all there is. I'll have to do this forever, you know, and it doesn't lead anywhere. There's no point to it, and la di da." Um, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You know, there's no logical reason. Again, when we point to the limits of rationality, this sort of conclusion isn't something you reach logically. It's just an expression of your character, a reflection of your character. And so the person who responds in this way, all he is sort of showing is his lack of love for life. The Übermensch, which is another one of Nietzsche's very famous concepts, very vague and often misinterpreted. But the Übermensch, I've always read him as the person who can say yes to the eternal recurrence, who wouldn't just be okay with the eternal recurrence happening, but he would be happy. The demon would be a god to him, an angel. He would thank the demon for telling him this news, because he's sort of like, wow, my life forever, there's no greater news than this. And the Übermensch is someone who's not only capable of saying it in that moment, but he's somebody who would choose to recur, to who would choose the eternal recurrence in any moment of his life. You know, just imagine the worst tragedy that's happened to him. His entire family has just died, you know. Still, he would choose to recur life infinitely because he just loves it so much. Um, I guess the attitude Nietzsche wants us to embrace, I think, is always like a child who sort of goes on a roller coaster and just gets off the roller coaster and is just like, immediately another one, another one, another one. I must go again. You know, I love that so much. Yeah, that's the kind of attitude Nietzsche wants us to adopt towards life. And it's very, very hard, obviously, given our circumstances, to be someone who can at all times be willfully able to uh, um, recur our life infinitely. But that is why I think Nietzsche would put it as the Übermensch, the beyond human. It's a task for not for us, but for somebody who surpasses us right now, I suppose.
But it's something that we should strive to. It's an attitude towards life that we should strive to embrace.
Yeah, I think that's the way Nietzsche would understand it. I think, again, it's a bit controversial to say this, especially because, as we've been stressing throughout this whole talk, Nietzsche is a very anti-teleological, goal-oriented thinker. So, if obviously if you put sort of the Übermensch or affirming life as your goal to reach, that's a bit self-defeating, and you know that's not great. But I'd say generally, you know, yes.
So then, so then, explain to me now why, from a I'm trying to bring in the Zen Buddhism here because I know there's a critique of the eternal recurrence from the Zen Buddhist perspective, but I don't want to just jump into the critique right now without talking about what Zen Buddhism is, talking about how the anti-soteriological perspective or the anti-salvation perspective is also rooted in Zen Buddhism and maybe what Nietzsche has said about Buddhism uh, in the past. So there's not really a question in there except can you just talk to me about like your paper explores both Nietzsche's perspective and the Zen Buddhist perspective. Can you talk to me just about why you think that the Zen Buddhist perspective fits with Nietzsche's philosophy?
Yeah, so Nietzsche does speak about Buddhism a little bit, and though he has some positive things, remarks about Buddhism, like for instance, he says it's a religion in his terms beyond good and evil. You know, it doesn't hold to an objective morality. It doesn't morally condemn non-adherents of the religion. It's sort of very empirically based. It focuses on getting rid of suffering as the main goal, not getting rid of like sin or anything like this. Still, Nietzsche has a generally negative view towards him. He sees it as like a more advanced stage of nihilism, which is sort of like coming into Europe as a secular nihilism that will replace the Christian nihilism. And I mean, he's not incorrect. I mean, you can see why he jumped to the conclusion. I mean, typically Buddhism is understood as as a soteriological goal of Buddhism is to um, escape from the reality of the here and now, which is we're stuck in the cycle of birth and rebirth, samsara, which is characterized by dukkha, which is dissatisfaction or unease, suffering in sort of bad translation. And the way to get out of it is sort of by doing these practices and meditating and in doing these things that the Buddha recommends. You can reach nirvana, which is sort of like a cessation of suffering, where you forget the self and uh, enter unconditioned existence, which as you might surmise, is sort of pretty much exactly like a Hinterwelt, any other Hinterwelt that we've been discussing before. There's a goal to get out of the here and the now and achieve a state where an ideal state in which we're saved from the here and the now. The thing that might even be more distressing for Nietzsche is sort of the loss of the self. Although I'd say Christianity also has this. It's sort of Nietzsche might see that as a sort of self-hating kind of thing. But anyway, yeah, Nietzsche was only familiar with sort of poorly translated texts of early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, which he sort of got from Schopenhauer, his mentor. And Schopenhauer interprets it in a very pessimistic sense. Schopenhauer is a noted pessimist, great philosopher, by the way, but definitely a pessimist. And Nietzsche's interpretation of Buddhism is very much colored by this. Nonetheless, Buddhism has gone through sort of 2,000 years of development since Nietzsche understood it. And Zen, Mahayana Buddhism, is sort of the opposite branch of Buddhism. And particularly Zen, I think, push back against the narrative of Theravada in a very similar way that Nietzsche does. The reason for this, with Zen in particular, is because this is when Buddhism migrated north into China and sort of fused with Taoism. And Taoism already has a lot of agreements with Nietzsche in terms of sort of the anti-teleology and purposelessness. The sort of the main tenet of Wu Wei of non-action is often translated as effortless action, but maybe a better translation, people have argued, is purposeless action. That is sort of the standard for how to act in accordance with reality, because reality is itself purposeless. So yeah, very different from the Socratic sort of news that's embedded in reality, and there's a fundamental ground, as you were saying. So when Buddhism comes into contact with Taoism, they fuse and make Zen. And Zen pushes back heavily on all this rhetoric and almost to an irreverent degree, right? I mean, Linji, for instance, one of the Zen scholars, is famous for his phrase, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha, you know? And it's meant to be a get rid of anything external from yourself that you think will get you enlightenment. The idea that there is a path, that there is something to get, there is such a thing as samsara and nirvana, and some place you need to go in order to attain enlightenment. That is sort of what is keeping you from enlightenment in the first place. You know, the first shift is with Nagarjuna, who's like the most famous, most important Buddhist thinker outside of the Buddha himself. And his main contribution is shunyata, which is emptiness. And emptiness is sort of a radical reformation of dependent origination, which is one of the core Buddhist doctrines, which is that basically the interdependence of all objects and ideas and things. Everything is dependent on something else, and everything exists in this way, where there are no essences, there is no singular existence, and yeah, everything is dependent on itself. Emptiness takes this even further, where it says that not only are sort of things empty, but even philosophical doctrines are empty. They only make sense in relation to other things. They only make sense sort of in the context from which they arrive. So when you had the historical Buddha speaking to the people in 1500 BC and telling them about samsara and nirvana and how to attain enlightenment, this isn't some ultimate truth that's you sort of separated from everything else that we have to strive towards. Like, no, it's a way of doing expedient means, which is sort of a partial truth, a contextual truth, which is supposed to help someone attain realization. For the people at that time that the Buddha was speaking to, he had to speak in words that they would understand in that context. And so he spoke of samsara and the liberation from samsara and meditation and whatnot. But these aren't ultimate truths. Ultimately, everything is empty. And even though that already sort of takes away a lot of the soteriological thinking, right, of getting rid of an ultimate truth, there's still, depending on the school of Mahayana, there's still some soteriology. Like, the goal becomes, instead of attaining nirvana, you're understanding emptiness, and then sort of you attain nirvana. But Zen especially pushes back heavily against this. An important thing, even before with Nagarjuna, but is also the emptiness of emptiness. The concept of emptiness itself is itself empty. It doesn't have any content. It's not a belief. It's not something to achieve. It's more sort of a rhetorical tool to get you to understand certain truths, and you have to abandon it at a certain way as well. Yeah, and the notion of the no self is still prevalent in Zen, and but rather than being a sort of self-hating doctrine, as the earlier one might be seen by someone like Nietzsche as a sort of will to destroy oneself to escape actuality. The no self is, I think, in Zen, a way for you to fully affirm existence. Right, the thing that's preventing you from affirming existence is the self itself, because the self, I think this is sort of the key insight of Buddhism, is that the self, when there is an ego self, it necessarily reaches for salvation. It necessarily wants to escape from its present position, because the self wants to be independent. It wants to have this standalone existence and be sort of the ground for its own being. But it can't do this because of dependent origination, the fact that everything is interlinked, including the self. And so it constantly strives to try and ground itself in something. And the way to affirm existence is to sort of forget the self. And so I would say the goals in both Nietzsche and Zen are very similar. It's an anti-soteriology in both. The goal of both is to try and get rid of the notion that there is something that you need to be saved from. The notion of there being a goal or a purpose to reality and existence.
Wow, that was certainly a lot. I wrote down here that the self reaches for salvation, and so the only way to affirm existence is to get rid of the self.
Mm-hmm.
But Nietzsche would say, actually, affirm it, like the difference, as I understand it, is the path to this anti-soteriology or anti-salvation for Zen Buddhism is to get rid of the self. For Nietzsche, it's to affirm the self.
I would say this is part of where the critique gets a bit shaky, because Nietzsche also doesn't believe in a fundamental self. The self for Nietzsche is still like a set of drives that are sort of competing. There's no core to the self, and the sort of dualities that we always impose onto the world, such as subject and object, are more like products of language, sort of simplifications for evolution that sort of helps us survive, useful tools. Um, yeah, so Nietzsche as well has a notion of the self. But I do think that fundamentally what you're saying is correct in practice. I think in practice, Nietzsche doesn't quite embody the forgetting of the self. Uh, the fact, I think, that Nietzsche's work, Nietzsche's thought contains within it a lot of tension still. This sort of existence is still something that's almost antagonistic for Nietzsche. Like there's a need to affirm it, sort of as a heroic struggle against nihilism that he sees himself embarking on. And yes, those notions are notions that like reinforce the self. And I think the where the eternal recurrence comes into this is that the eternal recurrence is fundamentally still a willing of amor fati, a willing of um, existence to repeat itself infinitely. Um, and the fact that there is a willing means that there's still sort of a self, obviously, to do the willing, and there's still sort of like some kind of antagonism, some sort of separation of the self from the world. Um, as I was saying with joy, the eternal recurrence. If you look through the book Zarathustra, which is Nietzsche's main book on the eternal recurrence, the origin of the eternal recurrence lies in sort of like a deep joy, a love for life. You love it so much that you want it to recur infinitely, right? Um, so this deep joy, however, I think for Zen, I think the joy would not be deep enough. Sort of Nietzsche is almost like a few steps away, maybe, because the deepest joy for under a Zen perspective doesn't want to recur, doesn't want anything, because there is no self. It's fully satisfied with existence and needs nothing from it. Nietzsche's sort of like desire to make existence recur still sort of like betrays uh, a subtle hint that he doesn't isn't perfectly content with reality as it is, because he sees the need for existence to recur infinitely. um, when you experience sort of the most profound joy for Zen, you don't experience anything. There is only the experience. There's a complete collapse of the separation between the self and reality. You know, we can think of the eternal recurrence. This is a good analogy. Is sort of, when you're getting enraptured by music, and sort of you start thinking, I wish this would last forever, or any positive experience. You start thinking, I wish this would last forever, and it's sort of that very thought is what sort of takes you out from the experience and separates it and sort of puts you back to reality in crude terms, right? I think we can. That's a pretty good analogy, because it's sort of the ego self reasserting itself. The desire for the continuation of that experience is what causes the joy to be lessened, right? And yeah, if the joy is deep enough, obviously that desire wouldn't be there in the first place.
I have two questions. One is a point of clarification. So when you're talking about this idea of getting rid of the self from Zen Buddhism, is that just something like the way it sounds like is it's like you're just existing and you're content with that existence in the world around you, but you're not you're not seeing yourself as a a definitive main character in this world. You're just living, and whatever happens to you happens, and you're content with that. Now, is that an oversimplification of the theory?
I mean, obviously, it's a simplification, but I'd say that's quite accurate in general. I think it's the lack of purpose that's important, right? You don't need anything from reality. The noble truths of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, are basically that there is sort of an inherent suffering, dissatisfaction in reality, and that suffering is caused by grasping, and grasping can be understood as in you want something out of reality. Reality isn't good enough for you, so you need to try to extract something from it. And so the self is that which grasps, and so letting go of the self is letting go of the grasping, and you're sort of just like fully taken over. You don't need anything to happen to you. You don't want anything to happen to you.
But with Nietzsche, it's like I want the self to I want to feel the pain. I want to feel these emotions because this is this is I want to very much affirm the things that are happening to me.
Yes, I'd say he finds meaning in the struggle itself. The struggle to affirm is what like gives him meaning, and so the struggle to impose an eternity and make things eternal, right? But that's still a struggle that's destined to fail because you can't actually make things eternal.
Now,
Everything is
now,
transient.
now, to me, the Nietzsche ideal not only sounds much more plausible. I think it's a more just I'm just speaking personally. It seems more attractive of a philosophy to have. But I want to ask you: Is this getting rid of the self? Is this something that you personally think is a plausible ideal that we can actually work towards getting rid of the self? Is the Zen Buddhism idea something? Because I understand it in the abstract and in the theoretical, but I don't even know if that's desirable to be honest
Mhm.
in the first place. And two, I don't know if that's fully possible.
Yeah, so obviously, like it's very confusing the whole no self doctrine. It takes a lot of sort of time and thinking about it in weird ways to get into it. And I mean, even I, who am studying this thing, I can say I don't understand it fully because it's something quite strange. But I mean, according to a Zen position, that's fine. There's actually nothing to understand in the end. There's no like hidden truth behind it. But in any case, the when we talk about sort of forgetting the self and getting rid of the self, you don't actually mean getting rid of like get really not having any sense of self at all, but it's more about realizing the inherent interconnectedness with everything and not striving, as I was saying, not grasping onto things or needing things from reality. So it's a different way of viewing the self, sort of the self as we view it now. We sort of always think that there's something wrong with ourselves right now, and we always seek to get rid of it through whatever means possible. And this can go back to sort of the secular salvation we were talking about. I mean, you can do a very good, I think, Buddhist analysis of the way we seek to relieve our sense of lack from by using these secular salvations. We're sort of under a Buddhist hypothesis, we're always haunted by sort of this sense of lack, that there's something wrong with me right now. And the reason is because the self as I want it to be doesn't actually exist. The self isn't grounded. It isn't this like stable sort of metaphysical entity that's like separate from everything else. Um, and Well, forgetting the self is basically letting go of this need to ground yourself in anything, letting go of sort of the idea that I must do this in order to have value, otherwise I don't have value. It's an sort of infinite um, a realization of sort of the inherent valuelessness, but also um, value, the source of value. There's this paradox as well. Like valuelessness, value comes from valuelessness in a very real sense.
But do you personally find that desirable?
Uh, yeah, I would say so. Generally, if this kind of thing is possible, I think yes, I would say. Um, Again, the way Zen conceives of enlightenment is not some like mystical state that you've got to achieve. That's going to be there forever. We've all had like I think moments of enlightenment. I mean, the specific term I think that's useful to understand for the purposes of the Nietzsche comparison as well is tathata, right? It's that, which literally means suchness. It's experiencing sort of reality as such without mediating it um, through any of your own sort of like personal biases and concerns and wants. You know, um, and as I was saying, I think the moments of joy and I think even aesthetic experiences, they're always at their highest when you sort of forget your own personal concerns. I mean, me personally, I can say, um, and this relates to things like flow state as well. For instance, in modern psychology, you would say when you're sort of really focused and involved in an activity, you always forget yourself. It's like yourself that you deal with in normal days, sort of the desires and the preoccupations that sort of drive you in ordinary life aren't there. And the way I would see the Zen form of forgetting the self is to sort of, always be in that state or be in it as much as possible.
Okay. I think this Zen Buddhist perspective for me is going to take. Well, could you just try to just in very like simple terms say what it would be like for an ordinary person who is in the Nietzschean state to then transition to the Zen Buddhist state? Would their life change in any tangible sense, or is it entirely in the psychological state that the different distinction between the two is? Like how, because again, this idea of forgetting, of letting go of the self, in principle, that's a concept that I can grasp and understand, and theoretically it makes sense. But it strikes me as something where it's like it's impossible for people to grasp until they have achieved it. And maybe even then they don't know exactly what it is. They just know that they are in it.
Hmm. Well, the Zen perspective is particularly strange, I'd say, but also more simple in a sense, where there isn't actually something you need to realize. There isn't actually a special state in which you have to reach. Despite what I've been saying, if you think you're enlightened, then you're not enlightened, because you you clearly haven't got it. Um, you sort of have these. You've taken these ideas of what you think enlightenment means from somewhere else and sort of like imposed them on yourself and done this kind of thing. But in comparison to Nietzsche, I'd say like even more charitably would say that sort of the Zen no self state is what Nietzsche was aiming for in his life, but didn't quite get. And I'd say that might be going a bit far, but uh, I think it's possible. In terms of the difference between the two, I'd say again, Nietzsche perpetuates this struggle against existence. It's sort of like a triumph that needs to be had, which maintains this teleological attitude, I do think, of like, life is something that needs to be affirmed, and we're going to get to that point later on. You're delaying this. And Zen, I think, would be the full realization of this. Nietzsche has a very good quote that I like, where he says, "Mature manhood is regaining the seriousness one had as a child at play." You know, and I think that embodies the Zen ideal. The playfulness often comes in a lot with all the masters, because there's no point to what they're doing. There's no ultimate purpose. They're just doing it as a reflection of existence in a sense. But it doesn't mean that they're sort of unserious about things or they don't care about anything. Because if you look at children in play, they're very serious when they play. They're very involved in it, right? But they don't sort of actually care about it in an existential sense.
Turning more to, well, shifting gears a little bit, and I know if you're listening, you might be like, what the fuck is going on? And like, I get that because I'm a little bit in that same boat too. William here is a brilliant philosopher and an expert, and it's gonna
Yeah.
take a lot to get on his level.
As I was saying, no,
But
Zen is an entire tradition, so it's quite difficult to condense it all very quickly. And I mean, even that's a problem with my paper. I'll fully admit that it's comparing one thinker to an entire tradition, which is a difficult challenge, and especially to someone who's familiar with neither, it's quite difficult. But yes.
are you planning on publishing this, William?
Um, I mean, not at the moment. No, I'm presenting it at the conference, but we'll see. I hope to develop it into a future paper, which might go on.
Okay, well, I'll just say if it does get published, or if you want to put it on like a WordPress or a Substack for people to read, and I could link it in the description if people want to people want to hear more or read the paper and then listen to the episode, or listen to the episode, read the paper, and then listen again.
Mhm.
But we can talk about that after. I know you are interested in this philosopher too. I know he ties into Nietzsche. He ties in a little bit to Buddhism too, and I think it's worth bringing it up, particularly around this time of the year. And that's Kierkegaard. And I mentioned to him a little bit in the beginning that I thought some of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity didn't, of being an extension of the Platonic tradition, didn't hold up necessarily to Kierkegaard's conception of Christianity. Now, for those of you who don't know, Soren Kierkegaard, he's a Danish philosopher. Nietzsche is German. That's not really relevant, but he grew up in a very religious background. He, like Nietzsche, suffered a ton in his life. He had many, many ailments. So many people close to him died when he was at a young age. He lost so many family members. He himself ended up dying at 34. Or maybe it was 36, but there was something where he thought his entire life that he was going to die at the same age Jesus died. And he got like really, really close. But had a life of immense suffering, was crippled, I think, a little bit, although I'm not 100% sure about that fact. So yes, immense of a life of immense suffering, who was also grouped into the existentialist category. And
Proto-existentialist, I'd say, right? But yes.
yeah, well, Christian existentialist.
Yeah, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are sort of like the forerunners to existentialism generally.
Right. And he like Nietzsche has this critique of reason, in the sense that he thinks that reason or our rational capabilities are not capable of accounting for I don't remember how you said it, but you said it in a much better way than I put it. But
The instincts.
it is it's not capable of accounting for all of our moral understanding. It's not capable of encapsulating every normative action of the normative actions that we want to take, or that we value. If that let me try to say it in a different way. That reason and these kind of the using reason for morality can only get you so far. He thinks that there is a level above reason that reason can't account for, that is just as important, if not more important, than reason in terms of moral thinking. So he's very much on board with Nietzsche in that criticism. Now, I don't know where exactly the best place to kind of put the parts of his theory into this are, but essentially, and again, William, please help me out, but for Kierkegaard, he agrees that there's this idea of embracing like the suffering, embracing the things that happening to you, and not trying to just reason your way to a he doesn't see where Nietzsche critiques people who see the current world as worse and bad, and then this higher world as being separate, and the goal is to leave the current world and get to the higher world, where he sees that as bad. Kierkegaard is much more focused on bringing those two worlds together.
Yes, I'd say that's a very, very key element to it. I think, well, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are preoccupied with very similar things. They are actually very similar thinkers who lived at around the same time as well. And well, my current research project, my thesis, is going to be about a comparison with these two, and then eventually I want to get Zen Buddhism in there somewhere. But yeah, I think both of them have the subjectivist turn, right, where they see values as being inherently subjective, something that you have to come up with your own personal connection. The important difference is with Kierkegaard is that sort of it's in personal connection with God, right, which sort of gives them a sense of of objective authority. But in the end, it's not really morality as we understand it normally is something that can and will be transcended when God demands it. Right. This is
Mm-hmm.
the what he gets in Fear and Trembling. I don't know how much we want to get into that, to be fair, but I think Kierkegaard is the interesting thing about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche comparison is that Kierkegaard is very much like an anomaly in Nietzsche's sort of like framework for a typology of the Christian, right? Um, Kierkegaard would pretty much agree, I think, with most of Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity. Um, because Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity are not
Mm-hmm.
really against Christ, the figure, or anything. It's much more to do with sort of the social impact of Christianity. And Kierkegaard's whole career, despite being a Christian, was criticizing the Danish church and the institution at his time and saying that nobody was really a Christian at his time. Nobody actually embodied the Christian faith because the institution of Christianity at the time was sort of just like a crutch for people to um, stand on. It wasn't anything. I think Kierkegaard has a great quote where he says, in a world which everybody is trying to make things easier, I want to make one thing harder, and that's faith. You know, faith for Kierkegaard doesn't provide comfort. Faith isn't this sort of like beyond world that one looks to when one is dissatisfied with the current world in order to relieve oneself of dissatisfaction. No, it's sort of it's a source of strength. It's a call to personally engage with the world in a way that you take the transcendent and make it immanent. And to not use technical terminology, the transcendent would be this the hint world we were talking about, this other world that is sort of like superior and separate from this world. Um, and Kierkegaard, sort of, with his intrinsically personal relationship with God, sees the task of affirming life as one of, instead of, um, as in Nietzsche, getting rid of the other world entirely, it would be one of bringing the other world down to the here and the now, right? To have God, realize God's um, transfiguring presence in your everyday life and in the world around you at all times.
Right. The idea that Kierkegaard critiques so much is uh, that the self, like the grounding your your self value, and this is where it gets really complicated with terminology. Your self value, like your true self, um, in relation to something that you think is higher or better. So, like, if you first, let's take love for example. If your standard of love or the love that you have currently, if you're saying, well, my love, the love that I have right now is inadequate, I need something better, I need to uh, take XYZ steps to get that ideal form of love, and I can do that through rational steps, rational means to actually get there. That is the thing that Kierkegaard heavily critiques, right? He thinks there is the idea that you can rationalize on your own to make your life better, to get to something, a point of no suffering, a point of better existence. That is actually like despair. That is how you stay in the state of despair. If you're not willing to to give up the idea that you on your own can reach like a better state, a more like if that you can improve your suffering, then you're destined for despair.
Yeah, well, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard's idea of the self is also very interesting. I mean, there's the one definition of the self that's always sort of a bit of a meme. It's parodied because it's what, like, the self is a relation to the self that relates itself in self. Yeah, I encourage anyone to look it up. It's very funny. It's complicated to the point that some people think that he's parodying Hegel while writing that. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that because it does make sense when you sort of get into the weeds of it. But the
I
main
actually did.
thing, yeah,
I was gonna say I actually I don't know if you remember this, but I did a whole my thesis last year was on this idea, and I used the idea of a souffle to explain this concept and how I took that whole definition of the self and the relation to the self as it's relating to whatever it is. And yes, it's very complex, and I probably am like again when you're deep into it, you think you understand it, and then when you take a step out, you realize you really don't understand it.
yes, yes. Of course, I remember reading your thesis. I could never forget. Um, yeah, but so the important thing I think to take out of there is that the self for Kierkegaard is not something stable. It's not something sort of atomistic that's separate from the rest of the world and from God. It's a relation, right? It's always constantly relating to itself. It's in a state of becoming. You know, the self is something that you have to commit to in order to realize and to um, sort of transform. And in that sense, it's actually very close to Buddhism. That's where you can immediately start making comparisons to the dependent origination doctrine. But wait, yeah, oh dear. Um,
God bless you.
Thank you. What was I saying? Something about the self. But what were we relating this to? Oh, I can't hear you anymore.
It's because my mic was off.
Yeah,
You were saying that the idea of the self relating to something else has immediate comparisons that you can start drawing with Buddhism.
yeah. No, before that.
I don't remember.
Fuck. The self right to the self. Shit. What were we saying? Nah.
The self relates to this higher idea of the self, which is the self is a relation which relates to the self, which is also relating to God because God is the one that makes the self.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I guess despair, the way he talks about it, is a misalignment of the self. So it's sort of the self relating to itself in a way that is incorrect. That's based on sort of things that are not true, I guess. Um, and I think despair functionally is quite similar to the way Nietzsche speaks of nihilism as sort of a negative value judgment on life and on existence.
Well, I guess the comparison, right, is for Kierkegaard, this idea is that you can the critique is holding on to the idea that you can actually improve this relation on your own, that you yourself can I think I said this before and it's very abstract, but that you can reach that higher state on your own, that you can actually take steps to alleviate the the suffering that you have on your own. So for Nietzsche, for Kierkegaard, the only way to completely get rid of that suffering is actually to give up the idea that you can improve your situation, improve yourself, but paradoxically, while still believing that as you're giving up that self, you're becoming, as we said, the self in the higher order, the
The self relating to
or
God.
yes, the self relating to God, the more ideal or perfect
Yes,
self.
this is where actually the comparison with Zen Buddhism comes. I think it's quite similar to the concept of forgetting the self in Zen Buddhism. There's a really great quote by the Zen master Huang Po, which is actually, as soon as I read it, I remember I immediately thought of Kierkegaard. And he says, men are afraid to fall into the void because they think that the void is the realm of nothingness, something like this. Men are afraid to fall into the void or to forget this. Sorry. All right. Edit this out. Men are afraid to forget their minds, fearing to fall through the void, but they do not know that the void is not really the void, but the realm of the Buddha Dharma. Basically, what he's saying is that we often think of forgetting the self as leading to some kind of nihilism. You let go of your values, of what you care about, and that's going to sort of end you in a sense. But in the Kierkegaardian framework, the step of abandoning yourself, your own like personal desires, is sort of the necessary step that you need to take in order for yourself to become a vessel in a sense, for you to be united with God, with the rest of the universe in a sense, in sort of the correct way in which you can actually realize those values.
Say that one more time.
So forgetting the self in Kierkegaard is where you
Right.
let go of sort of your own personal desires of the way things you want to turn out, and you lay trust in God and hope that sort of you are absorbed into the will of God. And basically, the idea is that through your personal relationship with God, you know God so intimately that, and you trust God so much that you will get everything you want through it anyway. There's a trust in God that could be mirrored in the Zen sense when you have this sort of like trust in the universe. You let go of trying to grasp onto something that you think will be your salvation, and sort of you um, let the self be ungrounded, and that sort of that ungrounded self is like what you realize that you wanted all along from the grasping.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there seems to be this like fundamental unifying idea behind a lot of these people, but I would say even more like, and this I might get some heat from this from some people in the comments, if there is people in the comments, but I think even like there's a lot of similarities with actually the teachings in the gospel, and like what kind of Jesus' whole message is like, forget, you need to let go of this idea that you on your own are going to somehow better your life and make it more valuable, more worthy, more important by doing these certain things, by
Yeah.
um, we just talked about love, fame, money, but he would even say like the even like he would even
Even
extend that
morality,
to
right? Yes, even
even
morality as we
morality,
understand it as a social thing. Yes.
but even to the religious people at the time who were like, oh, by doing these certain religious practices,
Yeah.
these religious traditions, to get me closer to God, I am going to somehow like become a more important person. And he
Yes.
wants to shove that all under the rug and say, no, none of you are more important than the other. None of yourselves are more important
Yes.
than the other. The highest importance that you guys have, your entire worth, is in relation to God. And that is Kierkegaard's idea too. It's your entire worth is yourself grounded in God. Yourself grounded in something other than that is completely worthless. And you thinking that
Yes.
it is going to lead you to a life of constant despair, even if you don't know that it is.
Absolutely, that was actually brilliantly put. I totally agree with this. And Zen Buddhism has a very similar thing where attempting to ground yourself in anything is mistaken and is what leads to suffering and dissatisfaction and whatnot. The point of disagreement, I guess, is obviously Kierkegaard says that you can ground yourself in God, whereas the Buddhists say that there is no ground. Everything is ultimately groundless. And once you realize that everything is groundless, sort of you let go of the need for grounding in the first place. But there is a sense in which sort of as we were saying in the Kierkegaardian self, right? The self is something that is trying to be actualized. It's in the process of becoming something, right? And it's trying to actualize itself, and it's trying to do it through all these different things we were saying. And it's the same thing in Buddhism, right? The self tries to realize itself, to make itself real, because it's haunted by the fact that it isn't real in the first place. And in Zen, letting go of this need to be real, you find yourself realized by sort of the totality of existence in of itself. There's no need to be realized as separate from existence, which is what we're constantly trying to do. But existence as a whole basically realizes you as this sort of like formless no thing. It's not a thing, as in it's not like an existence, one thing, but it's also not nothing. There's this no thing which realizes you as such. So in that sense, it's not too different. And I mean, since we're doing comparative religion and comparative spirituality, I'm always reminded of the Einstein quote as well. I think where he puts it very well. He says that the goal of true religion, of any true spirituality, is basically to let go of this delusion of consciousness that you are a self separate from everything else. You know, all other spirituality that doesn't aim for this and aims for like sort of specific things that it wants is not true spirituality. And I mean, I think in this sense you can even branch Nietzsche in that thinker, as I was saying. He's a very spiritual thinker himself. But yeah, I don't want to obviously get too close to perennialism, and sort of try and ignore the differences in religion by making them all out to be the same ones. But I do think that the religious drive is obviously a fundamental human drive that manifests itself in very different ways. And sure, I would agree that the goal of true spirituality is to realize your ultimate interconnectedness with the universe, whether that be through God or through the no thing or Brahman or whatever other religions go about it. That doesn't mean that all religions are equally successful as well. You might say that some religions try to do it and do it wrong and whatever. But yes.
Quickly, I know that you had mentioned to me multiple times that you maybe wanted to get touch on this idea about the fear of death. Um, and I think it's not a supernatural transition, but it is. I do think it fits in this conversation, and so I want to push it into this episode, and maybe we can do a later one expanding on it more, or just dedicated to that. But I do want to um, get your thoughts, 2 cents on this notion, because this is a topic that I've probably either wanted to think about a lot, or had not wanted to think about, but
Mm.
actually have thought about because I can't avoid it. And it's the one thing that none of us can avoid.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Well, we've been speaking about the religious drive, sort of the spiritual drive throughout this entire conversation. That could be the focal point, um, maybe of this whole episode. And I think the spiritual drive is fundamentally intertwined with the fear of death, right? Um, I mean, as you were saying with Nietzsche before, that sort of nested within every fear is some kind of hope. And when there's fear of uncertainty, for instance, that manifests itself in like hope for truth, to ground you into something solid. And the same with fear of death. When there's fear of death, there's like a hope for immortality. And of course, that manifests itself in varying ways. In a cynical perspective, you'd say that's the source of all religions, is to try and quell this fear of death. But yeah, I mean, the fear of death is fundamental in sort of like everything to do. We don't think about it that much, but I mean, if we know anything from psychology, if Freud ever taught us anything, it's that the stuff that we don't think about is actually what drives our actions the most. Because we've repressed that which we don't think about. I mean, maybe I'll ask you this. It's something actually that I ask all people who are very much into philosophy, my fellow students or whatever, because I do think it's a fundamental drive, especially for people pursuing philosophy and intellectual. Was like, do you remember the moment you realized that you were going to die when you were a child?
Um, that's a good question. And I really hope that people in the comments, I'm gonna clip this and make this a TikTok video, and I hope that people in the comments give their answers. Um, do you know what? I probably thought about death for a really long time, like a really, really long. It's kind of an obsession. It was an obsession of mine. It still is. Do you know? I did you ever have this as a kid? I used to be kind of convinced that okay, so my name Athanasios, which is the full name, literally means in Greek the one who never dies. So it's been like it's been something that like I as a kid was like, oh, like maybe I'm unique, maybe I'm destined to and to never die, right? And then this was kind of right at the time of those Percy Jackson books were coming out, and I was like, maybe maybe I'm like this is full disclosure. I was like, maybe I'm like a demigod or something, or like maybe maybe I'm like different or something, or maybe like I'm past that. And that was kind of subconsciously because nobody wants to die. Nobody wants, especially when you're a kid, you think it's the worst thing possible. It's like, how can I that there just be nothing. um that is the ultimate fear, is like, and as a kid you don't think about this far down, but ultimately you're kind of thinking, if there is nothing after I die, if none of the actions in my current life matter uh, after I die, and the death is inevitable, then why does my current life matter? Why do the things that I do in this life matter? Why should I not just aim for maximal pleasure? Because there's no consequences. Like, why would that stop? You know, the wealthy king, the powerful king, from deciding to be like Raskolnikov, to the nth degree, and steal from all these people, steal their women, steal their wives, and just go for the maximum amount of pleasurable things. And the more you think about it, the more you're like, well, actually, the values and the things in this life aren't wrapped up in the things that you thought they were, like wealth, like fame, like power, whatever. Like, those things don't actually make your life enjoyable in this life, disregarding the fact that if there is a heaven and an afterlife, that might have consequences for you down the road. But still, I think the point holds that if there the idea of an afterlife, or a world where your actions in this current world have consequences for your life in eternity, it helps ground people's actions. I don't know who said this, but there's like a quote like, I don't believe there's a God, but I think we should all act as if there is. Or I don't know if there's a God, but we should certainly act as if there is, because we should act as if our actions in the current world have consequences for the next. And I remember your question. It was, when do you remember the first time that you kind of remember that you would die? Um, I don't know. That was my way of
Hmm.
saying it, but it's been consciously on my mind for a long time. Uh, and I think as a kid, I wanted to imagine that it wasn't the case, that it wasn't going to happen. And then, if you're lucky enough to never have anybody around you pass, um,
You don't have to think about it that much.
you don't have to think about that much. I I kind of, as I kind of got to like 7, 8, 9, 10, there was a series of people in my family that passed, and so it was kind of unavoidable, I would say. Um, and I don't know that I have an answer, because if we all act as if death is the worst possible thing, then the way I look at it is, if we're left in a position where we fundamentally agree that death is the worst possible thing, then it is possible for someone to, not only is it possible for someone else, another human, to like do something so horrible to another human, to inflict the worst possible thing to that human, but it also means that any God that does exist has permitted that worst possible thing to humans to happen. That highest amount of suffering. And I, number one, I'm coming from the fact that I don't think humans, we have that much control. I don't think, I think there is, I'm not willing to afford that much power to an individual or a group of individuals or even a nation to be able to inflict that amount of damage to another group. For example, I'll bring this to a current thing. I'm not willing to accept that when the bombs that are flying in Gaza and killing all of these innocent children and people. It's not that I want to give like the IDF any pass or whatever, but I'm not willing to accept that they have that much power to do that much damage to individuals. That's number one. And I'm also not willing to accept that the second point, which is probably is going to be less harder to convince other people, but I'm not willing to accept that God would allow that worst possible thing to happen, even though he does obviously allows people to kill each other and for death on a massive scale to happen. This was very long-winded, and I'm going to stop there. But the short answer is I don't know, but I have been thinking about it for a long time, and I want to flip the question back to you. Do you remember?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's a formative moment to a lot of people. At least there's a specific moment. I remember I was in a church school actually. We were singing some hymns, and then I sort of just like wandered around and I stopped singing, and I was just like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna die at one point, and then there's gonna be nothing." And I was just like weirded out by this. It caused like a sort of bizarre moment of like, well, what does that mean when there's nothing, you know? And I remember trying closing my eyes real hard, like squinting, being like, it would be something like this. But then I'm like, oh no, wait, that's still black. That's still like something. And I was disturbed by my inability to picture nothing, you know? And yeah, I remember that quite vividly. And I guess that's when you could say, in a sense, sort of the institution of the church failed to me. Failed for me, if we take this cynical view of, um, at least institutional religion being a way to quell the fear of death. But yeah, even though we don't often think about it, except for you, of course, you seem to be thinking about it a lot. But most of us tend to not think about it. It still affects you in the most ways, in many different ways, because well, when you don't think about it, clearly in my case, I had sort of a very disturbing thing that I don't want to think about a lot. So you repress this thought. But when you repress something, it doesn't just disappear. This is, I think, the best insight from Freud. It's the return of the repressed. That the thing that you repressed and you don't want to think about still comes back in sort of like different ways, in a sort of vampiric form almost. It's sort of like if you're at a party and you ban a guest from entering the room. He still manages to sneak in with like different disguises or something. And as you were saying before, sort of every fear has nursed within it a hope. And so most of these hopes, I think, manifest themselves as like a desire for symbolic immortality. If you don't do it in the traditional religious sense, where you seek immortality from religion, then they manifest as a desire for symbolic immortality. And that's the whole institution of morality. You can see it as such. I may die quite soon, but at least I have a special place in the universe because I'm acting morally, or it's obviously desire for to have children, to sort of expand family, and even sort of institution and culture. These are things which outlast your death and are supposed to be like more real than everything else. I mean, this view here is um, it's Becker's view on the denial of death. He talks about this, and I mean, you don't have to look at everything. He sort of says that pretty much all of human culture is this desire for symbolic immortality. Sublimated fear of death causes almost every single one of our actions. And I mean, there's even been empirical studies on this, which at least point to some kind of things, like judges, for instance, when they're giving out sentences, if they're sort of reminded of the fear of death before they give out sentences, they tend to give much harsher sentences. And the thought behind this is that they're sort of like reminded of the fear of death, which gets them scared and wants to seek security inside the sort of institutional justice system, which they feel is something that's outside of them and more real. So yeah, I mean, I think it's good actually that you think of the fear of death a lot, because it means you're facing up to it and you're not sort of like mediating it through these like different forms, these apparitions. And well, to bring it briefly back to Kierkegaard, I'd say that I think we can acknowledge that if you're religious just because you want immortality based on the fear of death, you're not really getting it. You're not having a true appreciation of what it means to have faith.
Well,
Yes, but
go
I
ahead.
think the key thing, the interesting about fear of death, when you get it from a Buddhist perspective, and in parallel to what we've been talking about so far, is that even the fear of death is one step removed from what we actually want to do. Becker and existential psychology seeks to sort of explain our actions through the repressed fear of death. But I think even the fear of death sort of could be a repressed fear of something else, which is sort of the religious drive we're talking about, the meaninglessness right now. I mean, you were saying that death is the worst possible thing we could think about, but I don't think that's quite true. Death isn't that bad. I mean, comparatively to lots of other things that could happen, death is not that bad at all. And it's sort of the fear of meaninglessness right now, because death is sort of a horizon upon which after that everything you've done is meaningless. And the idea is that even the fear of death is a sublimated fear of meaninglessness right now. It sort of delays it, so you don't have to think about it right now. You don't have to think about how everything is meaningless right now, so you put it into the future. You use time as a sort of delaying mechanism to be like, oh, this will be something for later, right? But in reality, it's right now, a problem that you have to deal with right now.
I'll say this because I told you that I think about it a lot, and recently when I was thinking about Kierkegaard, I kind of came to this realization, and then I'll add a caveat after I explain this. But this I haven't read a lot of Nietzsche. I haven't read a lot of Buddhism, but from Kierkegaard, the idea that fundamentally yourself on its own is like insufficient, like this idea that you can somehow make your life worth more, make your life better, reach some kind of higher purpose on its own. This idea that that's impossible, and that your self, as it relates to something else that's not God, is fundamentally flawed and insufficient. Well, just taking that and kind of applying it to everyday life and reflecting on my life and my experiences. And this is an argument that Plato makes, I think, in the Phaedo, or Socrates, depending on how you read it. But I think about the things in my life, and I have conceptions of the ideal. I have conceptions of not understandings, or not, and conceptions is the wrong word, but I understand. I internalize that there is something better in the things that I am doing. And I have to be careful about the language, because I'm not saying so much that it's like something that I can achieve, but I recognize that there is inherent limitations in those certain in my life. There's just certain limitations, not necessarily that can be improved or fixed with actions that I do, with circumstantial changes, but just that are inherent limitations. I see kind of like shadows of the fact that there is something better, higher, but that I can't obtain, that's fundamentally limited. And so as I'm living my life, and go and striving to obtain things, striving to have things, seeing value in various goals, various people, various emotions, whatever they may be. I do see that value, but I see it in a way that such I'm only seeing a portion of it, a part of it, a limited version of it. And the value that we ascribe to those things in society is that limited version of it. It is not the highest. Like the things that I strive for are fundamentally still limited in that life, that there is something higher. And so I take that and say, okay, the fact that I can still that I can still understand that there is that this is a limitation to life, for me, means, and I understand that there's arguments that can be made against this, but for me is enough for me to feel like that means that there is something beyond this life. And so I had kind of came to that realization, and that argument I didn't buy before, because I had trouble recognizing the fundamental flaws in my life's existence and the things that I seek. But now that I feel like I fully grasp that, I think I gave up from a deep perspective, the fundamental fear that I had of death. Now, the caveat is I still don't want to die. I still feel like,
I would hope so.
yeah, there's a litany of things that I would like to achieve, a litany of experiences in life, however flawed they may be, because we all have this, right? We have expectations, we have, you know, we have kind of, when we set out to do something, we have expectations of what those things are going to be, and often they fall short. In fact, I've never had them completely meet those expectations, not even in just terms of like the things that I thought were going to happen happened, but in terms of the feeling I would experience from those things happening was not the feeling or emotion that I anticipated or I wanted to happen. It was always less than what I wanted. But mind you, I still want those things, and mainly, and I think there would be a fundamental flaw in this from Nietzsche and somebody else, but mainly because I want some kind of value in those things. I want I want to leave behind in this world a certain meaning and value based on accomplishing those things. And that was convoluted in saying it, but what I mean is I want my life in the sense of I want the Athan Yanos that is the self relating to Athan Yanos to have meaning and to be shaped in the way that I want it to be shaped, and to live and to accomplish and spread the things that I want to spread in my life. And I feel like if I was to die now, I would feel like I wouldn't be able to experience and pass on and have that meaning. But when I reflect back, I still feel like fundamentally I've made leaps and bounds in avoiding, in being okay and accepting death. I feel like I'm at the point now. I'm at that. There's a great quote. He's an asshole, but there's a great quote by Woody Allen. He said, "I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there where it happens, when it happens." And I feel like that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, well, that was a lot, but yeah, I mean, it harkens back to what I was saying. Like, it's sort of death in itself. I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I think, in fact, it's the precondition for a lot of what we care about. Almost is that we're going to die. Because, I mean, I don't think immortality per se would be particularly desirable. Not at least immortality as conceived of us right now in physical bodies and who we are, because a lot of the urgency we have, the reason we find value in doing things is because we have a limited time to do it, right? If we were immortal and we had infinite time, we would just there's never any urgency to do anything. There's no reason to do anything right now because you can always do it tomorrow. um, and so I think the way our lives are sort of structured, and so the value is given in our lives, is from the very condition that death is included in them. And that's again sort of a false duality that we pop up between like life and death, that sort of they're two separate things and they're opposites to each other, as if like one could coexist without another. But they're both just dependent on each other, and they're both part of like a whole thing. And yeah.
Do you have anything else more to say on the subject? I think One thing I'd like to do, I would really like to do, is I'd like to bring in like a panel of like maybe like we can get together like 7 or 8 people and just one by one ask them lead the discussion with the question you just asked me at the top of this segment, which was like, do you remember the time that you first realized you would die?
Yeah, I
I
mean, I
would
think
love that.
it's a great question because it gets to the core of what a lot of people are doing and the reasons why they're doing what we're doing. I mean, I don't think it's the reason I was saying before that I ask it to philosophy students in particular. I think it's a haunt for most like intellectual people in general, or people who aspire to be intellectuals. I won't power myself up like that, but it does very often stem from this fear of death. You know, this need to be realized or recognized in some like special way. To yeah, and I think it drives a lot of behavior in most other fields. And sort of the relationship you have to death is obviously very indicative to the relationship you have to life, which is fundamentally core of who you are and how you relate to the world.
Yeah, I would. You've given me a lot of ideas for future
Mm.
episodes. William, you're in Milan right now?
Yeah,
Very cool. Are you looking forward to celebrating Easter with your family?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Usually I've missed out on Easter holidays for the past 4 years when we were in Edinburgh, actually, because we didn't have a proper Easter break. So this is the first actual Easter I'll get to spend in a while. So absolutely looking forward to it.
My flatmate this time is from Florence, and he was telling me about this the bread that you guys have on Easter. Um, a
The
little like
sweet Colomba.
sweet bread.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Colomba.
colomba. Are you having that?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Nice, nice. Um, do you guys go to like service or at all?
Some of my family does. Yeah, my mom and my brother do. I don't. I don't though.
Cool. Well, listen, this was a very dense episode.
Yeah.
Um, there's going to be a lot of clippage for sure. Um, I actually like have been recently getting a lot of traction on TikTok by posting clips. Um, and like they usually get in the most of them will get in the thousands,
Mm.
if not the hundreds, like the like multi hundreds. So I'm gonna do that for this one, because I think that's a really good way to get exposure. So if you're listening, follow us on TikTok. Um, and the great thing about TikTok, I'll just share this with. This is very off color from the rest of the episode. Talking about TikTok algorithms, but if like things like Instagram Reels, that they actually hurt you if you post more than once a day, or if you post like once a day even. Whereas TikTok really values you posting like 3 times a day. And if you're somebody like me who creates these like hugely long episodes, um, where you can create a ton of clips from, like ton of like 60-second clips from, um, having an algorithm that lets you post multiple times a day is actually very helpful. Um, but anyway, I'm not gonna bore the audience with that talk. Um, Listen, man, I really appreciated this conversation. I know you have your conference coming up soon. Is that in 2 weeks or 3 weeks? When is
No,
that?
it's in a few days actually. Yeah. So
A few days.
yeah, and
Oh
Wednesday.
my goodness. Well,
Well,
this
it'll be
hopefully
good
this was good.
preparation. That's for.
Hopefully this was good prep, and you can say at the end of your conference. And by the way, if you want to hear more,
Yeah, a longer form discussion. Your little
uh,
plug.
little plug. But no, this was. Is it going to be live streamed anywhere or recorded?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
It's a shame. It's a shame. But listen, I really enjoyed this, and you're always welcome back for another discussion. I would like to do it in person. I'd like to have another discussion in person.
Yeah.
Number one, so we don't have all these technical issues, and number two, I just want to see your face. And um, but I
Absolutely,
think
absolutely. Thank you for having me on. It's been great to be on again and to speak with you like
yeah.
this again. And me too. Yeah, it's yeah. I miss you, man.
But I think the substance was not lacking this time.
No,
Um,
no, no, not at all.
so yeah, I'll hit the stop button. Stick around because it just doesn't want you to leave until it fully uploads. But I'll hit the stop. Anyway, thanks you guys for listening. Subscribe, obviously. Check us out on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and all those great platforms. Peace.
Goodbye.